Learning. We do it every day in the most diverse situations. But what is learning? Actually, learning is defined by Myers as a more or less permanent change in behavior as a result of experience. However, we are not always aware that or what we learn. Therefore, an implicit learning mode must be distinguished in addition to an explicit learning mode. For example, we learn French vocabulary in an explicit learning mode when being aware of what we are learning and that we are learning. The learning progress is achieved by practice and repetition. The implicit learning mode is often related to an activity in which we are unaware of that and what we have learned. Moreover, we are often unable to recognize or communicate any learning effect. While vocabulary for a foreign language is often learned in an explicit learning mode, during early childhood we often learn our first grammatical rules in our mother language in an implicit learning mode, when listening and responding to adults. For the acquisition of motor skills, however, it is not clear whether explicit or implicit learning modes are adopted. There are several reasons to assume that an implicit learning mode is adopted when learning a motor skill. First, it is obvious that we cannot be aware of controlling all our roughly 400 skeletal muscles used when executing a gross motor skill. Moreover, even experts are not able to provide detailed information on in which order their skeletal muscles are contracted when successfully mastering a movement sequence. Therefore, it appears plausible that humans are able to use their body without keeping in mind about its structure and functioning when performing skillful movements. In fact, scientists believe that conscious control would even interfere with and disturb the execution of successful movement. Overall, the lack of conscious control in skeletal muscles when moving not only relates to the execution of a motor skill, but to the learning of that skill as well. All in all, evidence suggests that humans use their body to reach some given goals without knowing exactly how they do so. As such, the human body may be envisioned as a dynamic system with self-organized properties such that goals may be reached without detailed knowledge about its structure and its functioning. In the implicit learning paradigm by Broadbent and Berry, subjects learned a goal-directed use of another sort of dynamic system without any knowledge about its structure. Here, the learners were asked to adopt the role of the manager of a sugar factory. Their task was to achieve a given production quantity, whereby they were only able to put the number of factory workers. This learning task was embedded within a computer simulation. In each learning trial, on the computer screen, a number for the current production quantity was presented. Then, the task of the subject was to increase, decrease, or maintain the number of workers to reach a given target sugar production. Unknown to the subjects, the production quantity at each stage of this implicit learning task was calculated through on a mathematical formula, including the production quantity in the previous stage, the number of workers entered by the learner in the present stage, and a small random number to calculate the present production quantity. Interestingly, most learners managed to achieve, respective maintain, the given target production without knowing anything about the underlying mathematical formula. Therefore, they had implicitly learned to use a dynamic system such that a desired result was achieved. In addition to the previously mentioned plausibility for an implicit learning mode during the acquisition of motor skills, researchers have forwarded two hypotheses supported by numerous experiments in this regard. For example, Richard Masters from the University of Hong Kong has published and examined a reinvestment hypothesis. With a similar idea in mind, Gaby Wolf from the University of Las Vegas forwarded and tested her constrained action hypothesis for the implicit learning of motor skills. Masters' reinvestment hypothesis claims that the use of explicit knowledge for the execution of a motor skills movement, if at all, is typically restricted to the beginning of a motor learning process. For example, when we think about how to start a completely new movement in a step-by-step process, explicit instructions may be used. In the course of the learning process, fewer instructions are needed. Eventually, the execution of the movement sequence may get automatized. Intervening the movement sequence, for example when consciously controlling the piano keys when playing a song, the fluency of movement sequence may get disturbed. The same is true when consciously controlling the elbow extension during a forehand stroke in tennis. Hence, in the words of masters, the use of recalled explicit knowledge is therefore a hindrance to the movement execution. Following masters' arguments, this is particularly true for motor skills executed under time pressure. In contrast, implicitly learned movement sequences are less susceptible to such time pressure, as learners are unable to reinvest explicit knowledge which they did not use or acquire during the learn process. As an alternative to learn a new movement sequence without using explicit knowledge in the first phase of the learning process, Master and colleagues suggest the utilization of movement analogies, perform the movement as if you, or metaphors, perform a similar movement, for example, a windscreen wiper movement. In his studies, Masters found that under second task conditions, for example, counting backwards from 100 in increments of 3, or under stress or fatigue, implicitly learning subjects performed significantly better than their explicitly learning counterparts. However, learning not only movements implicitly takes substantially more time. In one study, Masters had female students with no previous experience practice a basketball free throw for 2 days. The students were subdivided into 2 groups. An explicitly learning group, in which the participants received detailed instructions on how exactly to execute the movement, including information on the physics of throws. In contrast, the implicitly learning group was instructed to throw using the analogy to hinge their hand down as if they were placing a cookie on the plate elevated above. In addition, the implicitly learning student group was also given a dual task in which they had to regularly respond to an acoustic signal. This task was intended to prevent the use of explicit knowledge and conscious thinking about the movement control. As a result, the implicitly learning group achieved better throwing results. The constrained action hypothesis by Gabriel Wolf belongs to another theory of implicit motor learning. It claims that the conscious control of the movement execution would require attentional resources which, in turn, would interfere with the underlying motor processes. Instead, a focus on the movement outcome would not. In this respect, the constrained action hypothesis is tested by a comparison between an internal focus of attention versus an external focus of attention. The latter concerns the perception of events that do not take place inside the body but outside. In a study by Wolf and colleagues, 2 subjects groups were asked to balance on a wobble board. In one group, attentional control referred to the perceived pressure within the soles of both feet, that is, an internal focus. The other was asked to direct their attention to a visible mark on the wobble board that was located directly in front of their feet, that is, an external focus. In numerous studies, Wolf found that the external focus of attention was more effective than an internal attentional focus. This result was explained by an interference of non-conscious internal processes for the movement production through an internal focus of attention. However, Wolf did not so far consider for a lack of reference for internal body perceptions, which, in turn, are provided for a focus of attention on external events. Hence, searching for internal events that we cannot distinguish will clearly absorb cognitive resources and, as such, will disturb the motor learning process. Both the reinvestment hypothesis and the constrained action hypothesis are based on the assumption that conscious control of the movement execution is not necessary and would even interfere with it. In this respect, both Masters and especially Wolf follow an argument outlined by the philosopher Michael Polanyi as early as the 1960s for understanding implicit, respectively tacit knowledge. It means being able to do something without being able to say exactly how. The implicit knowledge, how to do it, can only be verbalized through the awareness of the sensory action result. Implicit knowledge is subdivided by Polanyi into a proximal part that produces a movement but cannot be verbalized, and a perceptible distal part. When acting, attention can in principle only be directed towards the distal part, that is, the action effect. If attention is redirected to the proximal part, that is, the motor processes which produce the movement, they will disconnect from the original movement outcome and thus will lose their original function. Therefore, directing attention to internal processes and not to the external effects leads to a disturbance of the movement. It follows that for the learning motor skills, in general, the focus of attention should be on the movement outcome, with the learner relying on how to use his body as a tool without having to understand how it works. Thus, in windsurfing, an example often outlined by Wolf, attempting to consciously control the multitudes of degrees of freedom that result from the interaction with the surfboard, rig, water, and wind, proves to be very ineffective and requires a high tolerance for frustration. This becomes especially apparent when one decides to focus not on one's own movement, but on the resulting effects, such as the effects on the surfboard. The success of this change of strategy is striking. While the reinvestment hypothesis and constrained action hypothesis on implicit motor learning are tapping on the negative effects of conscious control during the motor learning process, they are often limited use for the physical education teacher when constructing environments for the learning of complex motor skills, as in gymnastics or in dancing, for example. Here, at best, suitable movement analogies or metaphorical learning, as advocated by masters, may be applied, but are often hard to find. In comparison, Wolf recommends the instruction of subjects towards an external focus of the action effect. However, it remains unclear for the physical education's teacher how these recommendations may be implemented in a learning sequence for complex motor skills in the gym. For this purpose, it would make sense to apply the instruction for directing the attention to the action effect on a complex motor skill that has been broken down into several substeps. For the first part of the complex motor skill, the learner would start with an already known and similar skill using an analogy or metaphor. As compared to the original part of the motor skill, these would be slightly modified by adapting their action goal. In the first learning step, and in the subsequent ones, the subject will implicitly learn to achieve the desired action effect by targeting it through modified analogies or metaphors. In fact, studies have shown that learning via metaphors is as stress-resistant as implicit learning and shows effects as long-lasting as learning with external attentional focus. Following the ideomotor principle through the learning process, internal representations of the action effects will be neurally coded in common with the motor processes that are producing the action effects. Once the first part of the complex motor skill has been learned implicitly, the learner will move on to the second part, the third, and so on. Eventually, through the implicit learning process, repeated executions of the motor skill will strengthen common codes of action effects and associated motor processes such that an anticipation of an action effect would trigger the motor processes required to achieve it, and vice versa. In fact, researchers here assume that motor skills are stored in our brains only in form of their sensory action effects. All in all, to learn a new complex motor skill, the trainer or physical instructor should first break down the complex movement sequence into meaningful substeps, which are then learned implicitly through the use of action-effect control. For each substep, appropriate metaphors or analogies must be found for this purpose, so that the individual can learn the desired sub-movement by adapting an already familiar action-effect control from the metaphorical or analogy movements. Finally, the learning process is completed by lining all the movement parts together in a methodical series of exercises. The following example shows how metaphors can be applied to implicit motor learning in a school setting. We use the frontal handspring skill from gymnastics to point out one possible application. The frontal handspring begins in an upright stance with a one-legged hop in forward direction. During the hop, both arms are extended above the head. Then the trunk and arms are rotated toward the ground while the front leg is stepped onto the floor. Next, the rear leg swings up, extended, with both hands resting on the floor with arms extended as well. After the front leg was also elevated while extended, the hands push off from the ground in a bouncing way and the body enters into a curved airborne pathway. The frontal handspring ends with both feet landing on the ground while the legs are slightly bent at the knee joints. The usefulness of metaphors can be illustrated to the learner at several points while learning the movement sequence. To learn the downward movement of the trunk and arms implicitly, learners are asked to imagine that they are throwing a medicine ball in a forward-downward direction, starting from an overhead position with arms extended to a point on the floor about 1 meter away. To learn the upward movement of the rear leg implicitly, learners are asked to imagine that they should kick down a plastic rod from a support platform above the head with the heels of both their feet. To learn the bouncing push-off movement from the ground with both hands implicitly, the learners should imagine that they are resting in a handstand on a very hot floor surface for a short time, and therefore they must push off from the ground as fast and explosive as possible. As a preliminary exercise for the push-off movement from the ground, pushing off from a wall can be tried out as well. Here, when starting out, the learners stand in an upright stance about half a meter away from the wall. Then they drop forward and stop their forward movement with a bounce push-off with their hands from the wall to return to an upright stance. As before, learners are asked to imagine a hot wall surface as a useful metaphor for the explosive type hand push-off action. Adopting a curved airborne pathway, following the push-off from the ground with both hands, can be facilitated with the help of a wooden gymnastics box and a mat placed over it. Here, when learning the skill implicitly, the learners should imagine that during the airborne phase, their backs are gliding along the mat without touching or compressing it with their body weight.